Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman and this is History 107, and today we're going to talk about some revolutions. So the 20th century saw an unprecedented number of political and social revolutions. These were a key part of the larger process of political and social change. Major revolutions included the Russian, Chinese, Mexican, and Iranian revolutions, but there were also revolutions during the 1950s and 70s in Bolivia, Egypt, Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. Industrialized and newly decolonized nations were largely exempt, but otherwise the process, though hardly universal, was widespread. Now, revolutions resulted from peasant discontent, inept political repression, new ideologies, and resentment of Western influence or control. Liberal strands were less prominent than in the Atlantic revolutions around the turn of the 19th century. Revolutions generated authoritarian regimes for a considerable time, efforts at cultural change, curtailment of the traditional upper class, and some limitations on Western influence, though the range of consequences varied considerably. Revolutions also pushed more established regimes, particularly the United States, toward greater conservatism. Revolutions did not define the whole of the 20th century world history, but they contributed to major changes even outside the societies directly affected. Now, at the end of the 20th century, a somewhat more peaceful spread of democracy raised questions about the future need for revolutionary outbreaks. Now, this lecture focuses on the revolutions that began in the second decade of the 20th century and continued until the 1980s. We will look at the basic dynamics of these revolutions and how they helped launch fundamental changes in the contemporary period. Now, a revolution, as mentioned already, is a violent attempt to change the political system, introduce new social layers into the system, and effect social change. A revolution differs from a coup d'etat, which can be significant in an individual society but does not bring about fundamental changes. In the 20th century, we must differentiate between revolutions and wars of independence. Significant independence struggles took place in the 20th century, but they were not revolutions in the same sense of using violence to undertake a thorough political and social cleansing. The 20th century revolutions involved many parts of the world, including parts of East Europe, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. This geographical spread represents the extent to which activities that previously were regional now become global. The 20th century saw four major revolutions. The first revolution was the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920, reflecting a variety of grievances and involving a variety of groups. Now, middle-class liberals involved in the Mexican Revolution sought political and constitutional reforms. Peasant revolutionaries, such as Pancho Villa, were interested in land reforms. The goals of the Mexican Revolution were varied, and it took a decade of recurrent revolutionary activities for a settlement to be reached. The revolution ultimately resulted in limited land reforms, the installation of a one-party political system that provided political coherence, and genuine non-competitive elections. The Mexican Revolution was unusual in having limited direct influence elsewhere. The second revolution was the Chinese Revolution. Beginning in 1911, a group of middle-class revolutionary students and intellectuals overthrew the imperial system. The initial efforts to establish a Western-style parliamentary democracy were hampered by the power claims of regional warlords and landlords, by the invasion of the Japanese, and by divisions among Chinese revolutionaries. The new communist movement that was born in the early 1920s would ultimately prevail in China in 1949. The third Great Revolution was the Soviet Revolution in 1917. The Communist Revolution was inspired by Russia's hardships in World War I, long-standing peasant and worker grievances, and widespread concern about the police and authoritarian measures of the Tsarist regime. In 1917, the Bolsheviks took over and launched a period of significant political, social, and cultural upheaval. The fourth revolution, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, was hailed at the time as possibly the first great Third World revolution. It was not dependent on Western ideas of any sort, but was an Islamic revolution against undue Western influence and against an authoritarian and corrupt political regime. It urged a return to more fundamental Islamic political principles, and it was meant to inspire a wave of similar revolutions in other societies. In addition to these major revolutions, the 20th century, particularly after World War II, was peppered by other revolutionary surges in smaller areas. The 1950s, for example, saw revolution in Egypt, Bolivia, and Cuba. The 1970s saw revolution in Nicaragua. Vietnam constituted a revolution as well as a war for independence. Major upheavals took some time to work out in terms of attainment of revolutionary goals and adjustment of the society. This process may still be occurring in some of the 20th century cases. Now, revolutions never change everything. They always preserve significant segments of the old regime. The Russian Revolution, for example, replicated some of the Tsarist interests. The core components of 20th century revolutions add up to four basic points. The first component is a weak regime. Revolutions do not occur against a vigorous regime, even if they are corrupt and unjust in other respects. Second, every revolution needs at least one large group with elements who believe that violence is justified to achieve legitimate social ends. In 20th century revolutions, the most consistent provider of this muscle was the peasantry, plus, in some cases, the working class in cities. A third component of 20th century revolution involves what might be called an ideological buildup. Before the revolution, crucial ideologies are disseminated that help inspire revolutionary leaders. In Mexico, early China, and very early Russia, some revolutionaries were inspired by liberal and democratic principles. In Iran, the dominant ideology was a restatement of what some believers believed to be the fundamentals of Islam. The dominant revolutionary ideology of the 20th century, operative in Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and elsewhere, was Marxism, which called for an overthrow of the existing system by the working class. The fourth component in the 20th century revolutions was some degree of concern about undue Western ownership and influence, and we see this concern in Iran, Mexico, and Russia. Now, what did the 20th century revolutions accomplish? 20th century revolutions, although they might have intended otherwise, uniformly produced authoritarian regimes. Major revolutions inevitably result in internal backlash. Aristocrats, conservatives, and sometimes religious leaders begin to organize military movements against the revolution. And this action in turn induces the revolutionaries to impose authority. In many revolutions, significant foreign resistance is evident, which again inspires revolutionary leaders to lean towards authoritarian control to defend the revolution against its enemies. These impulses towards authoritarianism occurred quicker and more fully in the 20th century cases than had been true in the Atlantic Revolutionary period. Another major consequence of the 20th century revolutions was social change. The communist revolutions in Russia and China, for example, eliminated the landlord class, sometimes with brutality and sometimes with re-education or political discipline. Revolutions in the 20th century uniformly attempted cultural reconditioning to reorient cultural signals inherited from the past. Now, one of the triumphs of the Mexican Revolution, for example, was the emergence of a new popular culture embellished by artistic and architectural efforts to pay homage to the Indian heritage of Mexico and to improve the workers and peasants. The communist revolutions would spend much time emphasizing cultural re-education and new artistic principles under the banner of socialist realism. Finally, all revolutions, though to different degrees, reduced Western influence, at least for a time, and offered opportunities for political power to new groups of people. Those from worker or peasant backgrounds did not necessarily run the show, but there was significant political mobility, and with this, a surge of new blood, new interests, and new abilities to connect the revolutionary regime with ordinary people. Revolutions occurred in some places, not all. Revolutions have not yet occurred for the most part in countries that experienced an independent struggle during the 20th century or in successfully industrialized societies. Nevertheless, revolutions have influence beyond their borders. Marxist movements, for example, compel significant attention even in societies where revolutions have not broken out, as we see in India and Africa. Revolutions help engender other types of protest movements, and many also push regimes as a means of avoiding revolution into political and social change that might not otherwise be undertaken. 20th century revolutions helped create a new conservative bloc among world powers, ultimately headed by the United States. The United States undoubtedly entered the 20th century with a sense of its own revolutionary heritage and a certain sympathy for revolutionary strivings. From the Mexican and Russian revolutions onward, however, Americans became concerned about the impact of revolution on American property rights and values, and the potential for the importation of revolutionary movements into the United States. Now, is the age of the 20th century revolution now over? Despite significant movements such as the anti-apartheid struggle or the collapse of communism, we have seen no major revolutionary outbreaks for at least 20 years. The influence of Marxism as an inspirational ideology has diminished and will probably not be revived. As the world becomes more urban, the peasantry has almost disappeared. These changes might suggest that the current era of revolution is over, although the revolution may well occur at some later stage. In examining contemporary world history, what's important to remember is that even if the age of revolution has passed, revolutions provided a significant spur to change in the number of countries and a number of regions beyond the revolutions themselves. Now, a brief note before we end today's lecture. When I previously recorded this lecture, we had very few revolutions going on in contemporary history. However, with the advent of the Arab Spring in the early 21st century, it seems that revolutions are popping up again. So make sure you take a look at this in your studies, as the textbooks may or may not include this. So this is the end of today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. This is on the Age of Revolutions in the 20th Century in History 107.